first man died at dawn. By noon, a dozen more were dead. By sunset, all 100 were gone. These were not soldiers struck down by plague or victims of a simple poison. These were the 100 strongest, most handsome men in Babylon, each chosen for the supposed honor of a single night with Queen Semiramis. They had entered her bedchamber full of life. They emerged the next morning as walking corpses, succumbing one by one to a swift and terrifying affliction that baffled the kingdom's physicians. And while the palace descended into panic, the queen herself remained untouched, the sole, silent survivor of a night that had claimed 100 souls. This event would be whispered about for centuries, becoming one of history's darkest and most disturbing legends. What truly happened in the queen's bedchamber that fateful night? Was this an act of supernatural power, a previously unknown poison, or the work of something else entirely, a woman who had somehow become more than human and infinitely more dangerous? In this video, I'm going to walk you through 7 documented aspects of Queen Semiramis's reign that prove she wasn't just history's most evil ruler, she was something far worse. We'll start with the fatal night, examine the supernatural changes that terrorized an entire city, investigate how a mother's love became humanity's nightmare, and reveal conflicted archaeological evidence that's been hidden for decades. By the end, you'll understand why some knowledge was meant to stay buried. But what could have gone so wrong on that night that transformed a queen into something that wasn't quite human anymore? Because here's where it gets really twisted. This wasn't some mad rampage or fit of rage. Queen Semiramis spent months planning what historians now call the most methodical mass sacrifice in ancient history. Imagine being Theron, a 19-year-old slave who thought he'd won the lottery of his miserable life. Selected personally by the queen herself, moved to the palace, given the finest foods, daily baths in imported oils, told he was special, chosen, blessed. For 3 months, he and 99 others lived like princes. They had no idea they were actually being marinated. The preparation wasn't to honor them, it was to purify their blood for what modern occult researchers call a transformation ritual. And the truly disturbing part? One of them survived to tell us exactly what happened in that chamber. The selection process began 6 months before the ritual. Palace records, preserved on administrative tablets, show the exact criteria. Young men between 16 and 22, specifically chosen for physical perfection, virgin status, and what the texts call spiritual purity. Teams of royal assessors visited slave markets across the empire, examining thousands of candidates. Height requirements, dental inspections, even birthmark patterns were documented. But wait, it gets worse. The selected weren't just physically perfect. They had to be orphans with no family ties. No one to miss them, no one to ask questions. For 3 months, these 100 lived in a special wing of the palace. Their diet was strictly controlled. No meat, only specific grains and herbs that modern analysis suggests included mild psychoactive compounds. Daily purification baths using oils imported from Egypt and incense from Arabia. They were taught to read and write, given music lessons, told they were being prepared for divine service. The truly disturbing part. They were encouraged to write letters about their good fortune. Archaeologists have found some of these tablets. Young men writing about their gratitude, their excitement, their honor at being chosen by the queen. They had no idea they were writing their own obituaries. The chamber transformation took weeks to prepare. The queen's own bedroom, a space larger than most modern houses, was systematically converted. The floors were covered with obsidian tiles brought from distant volcanoes, each one inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The walls were painted with pre-cuneiform characters that predated known written language. Where her bed once stood, workers installed an altar made from a single block of black granite. Here's what most people don't realize. The workers who prepared the chamber were all executed afterward. Their bodies were found sealed in the walls, apparent victims of poisoning. The queen couldn't risk anyone knowing the full extent of the preparations. On the night of the spring equinox, with no moon in the sky, the ritual began. At sunset, the first young man was brought to the chamber. According to Theron's account, preserved on tablets hidden in the Temple of Nabu, each victim took approximately 6 minutes. The process was methodical, ritualistic, following a precise pattern that had been rehearsed for weeks. The queen spoke words in a language that predated human civilization. The truly disturbing part? The victims went willingly. Whatever preparation they'd undergone left them in a state of religious ecstasy. They believed they were ascending to divinity. Theron survived through what can only be described as a medical miracle. The paralytic poison used in the ritual, derived from a now extinct Mesopotamian plant, didn't affect him due to a rare genetic immunity. Modern researchers believe he may have had a liver enzyme variant that neutralized the toxin, but the poison was only meant to keep them still. What actually ended their lives was something far worse. Theron was forced to remain motionless, playing dead among the growing pile of corpses, watching as the Queen performed acts that would violate every content policy if I described them in detail. Let's just say that by the 20th victim, the Queen no longer looked entirely human. As the night progressed, the supernatural phenomena intensified. Theron reported that the temperature in the chamber dropped so dramatically that frost formed on the obsidian tiles despite the desert climate. Shadows began moving independently of their light sources, forming shapes that resembled massive winged figures. The blood from the victims didn't pool normally. It flowed in precise patterns toward the altar, defying gravity. By the 50th sacrifice, witnesses outside the chamber reported hearing multiple voices speaking in harmony, though only the Queen was supposed to be inside. The sounds that emerged weren't quite human anymore. The aftermath discovery came at dawn. Guards, following protocol, entered to attend their Queen. What they found made hardened soldiers vomit and flee. The Queen sat in the center of 99 corpses, arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, but she had changed. Her movements were too fluid, like water pretending to be human. Her eyes reflected light, like a predator's. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. Most disturbing of all, she showed no signs of fatigue despite being awake all night. If anything, she seemed more energized than ever. The guards who found her reported that looking directly at her caused intense vertigo and nightmares for weeks afterward. Ancient Mesopotamian beliefs held that blood contained the life force, what they called napishtu. By consuming the life force of 100 pure souls, the practitioner could transcend human limitations and achieve a state between mortal and divine. Similar, but smaller-scale rituals are documented across the ancient world. The Aztecs' mass sacrifices, the Celtic Wicker Man ceremonies, even certain Egyptian pharaonic rituals, all based on the same principle. But wait, it gets worse. These weren't primitive superstitions. Modern quantum consciousness researchers have proposed that extreme emotional states might actually affect local reality through mechanisms we don't yet understand. The specific timing was crucial. New moon, representing hidden knowledge. Spring equinox, the balance point between light and dark. The age and gender of the victims mattered too. Young males at peak vitality, virgin status ensuring their life force was unshared, orphan status meaning no spiritual connections to the living. The Queen didn't just randomly murder 100 people. This was a carefully engineered spiritual technology designed to break the barriers between human and divine. And the truly disturbing part? According to every account we have, it worked. The question isn't whether this happened. The archaeological evidence is clear. The question is how. How did absolute power corrupt so completely that murdering 100 innocent young men seemed reasonable? The answer lies in understanding the political situation. Babylon in 810 BCE wasn't just powerful, it was the center of the known world. And when you rule the center of the world, when priests tell you daily that you're semi-divine, when you have access to knowledge accumulated over millennia, maybe transforming into an actual goddess, stops seeming insane and starts seeming inevitable. Imagine trying to explain to someone today that you need to sacrifice 100 people for a promotion. We lose our minds when someone cuts in line at Starbucks, but this was considered a legitimate path to divinity. What's truly horrifying is that everyone involved, the guards, the priests, the palace staff, just let it happen. They prepared the chamber, they delivered the slaves, they cleaned up afterward. Because when your god queen says she needs 100 lives to achieve immortality, apparently you just start counting. Makes you appreciate that the worst your boss can do is send a passive-aggressive email, not literally consume your life force. But here's where the historical record gets even more disturbing, because after that night, Queen Semiramis wasn't the same entity that entered that chamber. The transformation worked, just not in the way anyone expected. Now let's talk about what happens when you successfully complete a ritual that would make modern serial killers look like amateurs. Because the most shocking part wasn't the mass murder, it was what Queen Semiramis became afterward. The historical records from multiple sources all describe the same impossible changes. Palace servants reported that she stopped eating normal food entirely. Her eyes became painful to look at directly, not metaphorically painful, but causing actual physical discomfort like staring at the sun. Shadows around her moved independently of light sources. She would hold conversations in languages that predated human speech, talking to presences no one else could see. But the real nightmare wasn't these party tricks from hell. It was her new ability to command absolute obedience with her voice alone. Imagine having a boss who could literally override your free will by speaking. No wonder the entire city started experiencing what we'd now call mass psychogenic illness. Or maybe it wasn't psychogenic at all. The physical changes were documented by multiple independent witnesses. Court physician Nabu Sharma, whose medical records survived on baked clay tablets, described anatomical impossibilities. The Queen's skin took on a subtle luminescence visible in darkened rooms. Her movements became unnaturally fluid. She could turn her head 180 degrees like an owl. The aging process didn't just slow, it stopped entirely. Servants who'd attended her for years swore she looked younger after the ritual than before. Here's what most people don't realize. Similar transformations are documented in other cultures. The Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep IV, certain Mayan rulers, even some Chinese emperors, all underwent similar rituals. All showed similar changes. All ruled through supernatural fear. The voice of command phenomenon was perhaps the most terrifying change. Multiple accounts describe the Queen speaking single words that compelled immediate obedience. A guard who refused to open the treasury heard her speak one syllable, and found himself unlocking doors against his will. A priest who tried to withhold sacred texts felt his own hands delivering them to her. A scribe who attempted to record her activities in secret discovered his stylus writing her praises instead. But wait, it gets worse. The commands weren't just mental, they were physical. Guards reported their bodies moving without their permission, performing complex tasks while their minds screamed in protest. The shadow phenomena defied all natural law. Servants reported shadows that moved against light sources, that maintained shape in total darkness, that seemed to watch and follow individuals through the palace. One account describes a shadow hand reaching out from a wall to strangle a servant who spoke ill of the Queen. Another tells of shadow figures standing guard outside her chamber when no physical guards were posted. The palace astronomer, attempting to study these anomalies, went mad after claiming the shadows had depth, that looking into them was like staring into an abyss that stared back. Her dietary transformation disturbed even hardened palace staff. The Queen ceased eating any normal food immediately after the ritual. Kitchen records show her meals going untouched for weeks. Yet she showed no signs of starvation. Instead, monthly feeding ceremonies were conducted in absolute secrecy. The only witnesses were select priests who took vows of silence. Those who broke these vows were found dead, their bodies desiccated as if something had drained all moisture from them. The truly disturbing part? Analysis of these remains showed cellular damage consistent with extreme rapid aging. Something had consumed their life force. The pre-human language she began speaking defied linguistic analysis. Court scribes attempting to record her words found themselves unable to complete the task. The symbols hurt to write, causing hand cramps and bleeding from the nose. The sounds she produced included frequencies outside human vocal range. Modern analysis of surviving partial transcriptions suggests similarities to glossolalia, but with disturbing consistency. She was speaking an actual language, just not one meant for human throats. Priests claimed she was communicating with the gods. Others whispered she was speaking to something far older and far worse. The mass behavioral changes in the palace were documented by foreign ambassadors. The entire staff began moving in synchronized patterns, turning corners at the same angle, blinking in unison. Individual personality traits faded as servants became extensions of the Queen's will. The Elamite ambassador wrote to his king that entering the Babylonian palace was like stepping into a hive where every bee shared one mind. The truly disturbing part? The servants seemed unaware of the changes. When questioned, they insisted everything was normal. even as they moved in perfect, inhuman harmony. Ancient Mesopotamian texts speak of humans achieving divinity through consuming divine essence. The gods themselves were believed to maintain immortality by feeding on prayers and sacrifices. By consuming 100 life forces in a single ritual, Semiramis had essentially hacked the system. She'd become a localized deity, capable of supernatural feats within her domain. But wait, it gets worse. The transformation wasn't stable. Like a badly installed computer program, her new divine operating system conflicted with her human hardware. The result was an entity caught between mortal and immortal, neither fully human nor completely divine, and increasingly unstable. Similar accounts exist across ancient cultures. The Aztec emperor, Moctezuma II, allegedly achieved temporary divinity through mass sacrifice. Certain Chinese emperors of the Shang dynasty were said to command the dead after consuming souls. The Egyptian pharaoh Khemuaset supposedly gained the ability to speak with gods after a ritual involving 77 deaths. But here's what most people don't realize. These weren't myths or propaganda. Archaeological evidence supports unusual phenomena around these rulers: mass graves with ritual arrangements, palace modifications matching supernatural accounts, sudden, inexplicable changes in artistic depictions showing rulers with non-human features. The political advantages of being perceived as supernatural were obvious. Who's going to rebel against a queen who can control your body with a word? What enemy nation will invade when your ruler commands shadows and speaks in the tongue of gods? The transformation, whether real or brilliantly faked, made Semiramis untouchable. But power corrupts, and absolute supernatural power corrupts supernaturally. The queen began using her abilities not just for rulership, but for increasingly twisted purposes. Palace records hint at ceremonies that would make the initial ritual look tame by comparison. Today, if your CEO started speaking in tongues and controlling minds, you'd call HR and probably the FBI. But in ancient Babylon, this was Tuesday for a god queen. The truly disturbing part is how normalized it became. Servants would casually mention that the queen was having her monthly feeding ceremony like it was a normal calendar event. Oh, can't meet then. The queen will be consuming ethereal essence in the throne room. Makes our modern complaints about toxic work environments seem quaint. At least your micromanaging boss can't literally puppet your body with demonic voice commands. But absolute power, combined with supernatural abilities, created a whole new problem for Babylon. Because it turns out, when your ruler achieves partial divinity through mass sacrifice, the city itself starts to pay the price. And I mean that literally. Babylon began to die. If you thought one transformed queen was bad enough, wait until you hear what happened to the greatest city of the ancient world. Because here's what they don't teach you in history class. Sometimes when a ruler becomes an abomination, their entire kingdom suffers the consequences. After Semiramis's transformation, Babylon experienced what can only be described as a supernatural plague. Not disease, but something far worse. Animals began fleeing the city en masse. Not just pets or livestock. Archaeological evidence shows mass migrations of birds, insects, even rats abandoning the city like a sinking ship. Plants started dying from the palace outward, in perfect concentric circles. The Euphrates River, lifeblood of the city, began running backwards for 3 days. But the most disturbing part? The apparitions. Hundreds of citizens reported seeing the same young men walking through walls, standing in corners, always silent, always watching, always with their throats slit. The animal exodus was documented by multiple sources. Market records show a systematic collapse of the livestock trade. Within 2 weeks of the ritual, every animal market in Babylon stood empty. Witnesses described bizarre scenes: domesticated cattle breaking through gates to flee, temple sacred animals gnawing through cages, even rats forming organized columns heading for the city limits. But wait, it gets worse. The animals that couldn't escape, those too young, old, or confined, died within days. Not from disease or neglect, but from what veterinary texts describe as spiritual exhaustion. They simply stopped living, as if the city itself had become antithetical to life. The botanical death spiral followed a precise pattern. Palace gardens died first, starting from the queen's chamber and spreading outward in mathematically perfect circles. Each ring of death advanced exactly 13 cubits per day, Plants didn't wilt or decay normally, they transformed into ash while still rooted. The Royal Botanical Archive, maintained continuously for centuries, records the complete destruction of species that had grown in Babylon since its founding. Ancient date palms that had survived droughts and floods turned to powder overnight. The famous Hanging Gardens, one of the wonders of the world, became cascading terraces of grey dust within a month. The Euphrates River incidents defied all natural law. For 3 days following the first botanical deaths, the great river reversed its flow. Fishermen reported water moving upstream with such force it capsized boats. But here's what most people don't realize. The water itself had changed. It ran thick like oil, dark as midnight, cold enough to cause frostbite in the desert heat. Fish died by the thousands, their bodies showing signs of rapid decomposition despite being freshly dead. When the river resumed normal flow, it carried with it things that shouldn't exist. Stones that whispered, water plants with what appeared to be eyes, fish with too many mouths. The apparitions of the 100 began within days of the ritual. At first, only those who had participated in preparing the ceremony reported sightings. A guard who had escorted victims saw young men standing in corners of rooms, visible only in peripheral vision. A servant who had prepared the ritual oils found ghostly figures in her kitchen, always watching her work. But wait, it gets worse. The sightings spread like a contagion. Soon, citizens with no connection to the palace reported identical visions. Always the same young men, always bearing the wounds of their sacrifice, always silent but somehow accusatory. Children drew pictures of the visitors before their parents saw them. The pattern of manifestations followed the spiral of bodies from the ritual chamber. The first apparition appeared where victim number 1 had died, the second where the second fell, spreading outward through the city in a perfect reproduction of the Queen's killing pattern. By the time all 100 were manifesting, they formed a citywide spiral of supernatural surveillance. Citizens reported feeling watched constantly. The sensation of eyes following them became so universal that people began walking with their heads down, afraid to meet the gaze of something that shouldn't exist but absolutely did. Sleep disturbances plagued every resident. The entire city began experiencing synchronized nightmares. Thousands reported the same dream, being in a dark chamber, surrounded by young men with slit throats, unable to move or scream as something approached from the shadows. Children woke at exactly the same time each night, 3:33 a.m., screaming about the broken boys. Adults developed chronic insomnia rather than risk the dreams. The sleep deprivation alone would have been enough to destroy the city, but the shared nature of the nightmares suggested something far worse than psychological trauma. Physical manifestations accompanied the apparitions. Objects moved without cause, always in patterns that mimicked the ritual spiral. Cold spots appeared in buildings, so frigid that water froze instantly despite Babylon's desert climate. Spontaneous fires erupted in the homes of those who had participated in preparing the ritual. But here's what most people don't realize. These weren't random poltergeist activities. Each manifestation connected directly to the ritual. Cold spots appeared where victims had lain. Moving objects traced the path the Queen had walked. The fires started where the ritual oils had been stored. The city itself had become a massive reproduction of that terrible night. Ancient Mesopotamian beliefs held that improperly conducted rituals could tear holes in reality. The space between the physical and spiritual worlds, what they called the barzakh, could be damaged by extreme spiritual violence. The mass sacrifice hadn't just transformed the Queen, it had wounded the fabric of existence around Babylon. Similar concepts exist in many cultures. The Greek idea of miasma, spiritual pollution that manifests physically. The Chinese concept of sha qi, harmful energy that accumulates in places of great suffering. The Celtic belief in thin places where the other world bleeds through. But Babylon had become something worse than a thin place. It had become a wound that wouldn't heal. Environmental factors alone couldn't explain the phenomena. Modern analysis of soil samples from the period show unusual mineral deposits consistent with extreme electromagnetic events. The mathematical precision of the plant death circles, the synchronized nature of the animal exodus, the specific pattern of manifestations, all pointed to an organizing intelligence behind the curse. Some researchers propose mass hallucination caused by ergot poisoning or other environmental toxins, but that doesn't explain the physical evidence. The reversed river flow left geological markers. The plant deaths created a specific carbon signature in the soil. The animal migrations disrupted ecosystems for decades. Whatever happened in Babylon, it left real, measurable, lasting changes. Political implications compounded the supernatural crisis. Trade routes began avoiding Babylon. Diplomatic missions reported back about the cursed city where the dead walked and shadows moved on their own. The economy collapsed as merchants refused to enter a city where their animals died and their dreams were haunted. But wait, it gets worse. Enemy nations saw opportunity in Babylon's weakness. If the city was too cursed for its own citizens, perhaps it was also too cursed for its god-queen to defend. The vultures began circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. But first, someone had to deal with the source of the curse. Imagine if Washington, D.C. suddenly had every animal flee, plants die in perfect circles, and ghosts of government victims appearing nightly. CNN would lose their minds. But in ancient Babylon, this became the new normal that everyone just had to live with. Traffic's bad, and the ghost of sacrifice victim number 73 is in my kitchen again. The fact that people stayed shows either incredible loyalty or that leaving a cursed city was somehow worse than living in it. Makes our modern urban problems, traffic, pollution, overpriced coffee, seem delightfully mundane. At least your city's biggest issue isn't literal hauntings by murder victims. But the curse was just the beginning, because when your city becomes a supernatural disaster zone, eventually someone has to do something about it. And that something would make the Salem witch trials look like a reasonable discussion. Now here's where we need to talk about the why behind the horror. Because the most disturbing part isn't that Semiramis transformed herself into an inhuman abomination, it's that she did it all for love. Specifically, love for her son, Adad Nirari III. You think helicopter parents today are bad? This woman literally sold her soul and murdered 100 people to ensure her baby boy would keep his throne. See, when her husband King Shamshi Adad V died, little Adad was only 10 years old. In the ancient world, a child king was basically wearing a "please invade me" sign. Enemy nations were circling like vultures, civil war was brewing, and court nobles were sharpening their knives. Any normal mother might have fled or negotiated. Semiramis decided to become something so terrifying that no one would dare threaten her son. Maternal instinct combined with absolute power and access to forbidden knowledge. What could possibly go wrong? The political crisis following Shamshi Adad V's death was worse than most histories admit. 3 different generals claimed divine right to the throne. The Elamites were massing armies on the eastern border. Internal documents show at least 7 assassination plots against the child king in his first month of rule. The Council of Nobles openly discussed replacing him with a more suitable candidate. But wait, it gets worse. Religious authorities questioned whether a child could perform the sacred rituals required of kingship. Without divine approval, Adad Nirari's reign was spiritually illegitimate. In the ancient world, an illegitimate king was an invitation for cosmic chaos. Natural disasters, plagues, and military defeats were blamed on improper rulership. The kingdom needed a strong hand, and a 10-year-old's hand wasn't strong enough. Semiramis spent months evaluating her options. Palace records show her consulting with advisors, generals, and priests. Flee to Egypt? Her son would be forever marked as the coward king who ran. Fight conventionally? A woman leading armies would invite rebellion and her probable defeat. Negotiate? Every compromise would weaken her son's future authority. But in the restricted sections of the royal library, she found another option. Tablets dating back to the first cities described rituals of transformation. Kings who had become more than human. Queens who commanded death itself. The price was terrible, but the power was absolute. For a mother, watching vultures circle her child, perhaps any price seemed reasonable. Her research phase showed methodical planning that makes modern serial killers look impulsive. She consulted sorcerers from India, priests from Egypt, shamans from the northern steppes. Each provided pieces of the ritual, fragments of forbidden knowledge. But here's what most people don't realize. She tested smaller versions first. Palace records hint at minor sacrifices, single victims used to verify the process. She calibrated the exact requirements like a scientist testing hypotheses. How much blood was needed? What preparations were essential? which incantations actually worked versus theatrical additions. By the time she committed to the full ritual, she knew exactly what would happen. The 100 victims weren't an arbitrary number. They were the precise amount needed for the transformation she sought. The maternal moments before the ritual make the horror worse. Accounts describe her spending entire days with her son, teaching him statecraft, playing board games, telling him stories of great kings. She commissioned portraits of them together, gave him precious gifts, wrote him letters to be opened on future birthdays. One surviving tablet contains her words, "Everything I do so you might live and rule in peace." She arranged for his education, selected his future advisors, even chose potential brides for political alliances, all while planning mass murder. The cognitive dissonance required to be a loving mother during the day and plan systematic sacrifice at night speaks to a compartmentalization that borders on psychopathy. The protection her transformation achieved was immediate and absolute. Within days of the ritual, the three rival generals withdrew their claims. One fled to distant lands, another took religious vows, the third was found dead in circumstances that suggested supernatural intervention. The Elamite armies retreated without explanation, their king claiming he'd received divine warnings in dreams. But wait, it gets worse. The nobles who had plotted against Adad-Nirari began supporting him with suspicious enthusiasm. Several confessed to crimes they hadn't been accused of and begged forgiveness. Others simply disappeared, leaving behind notes about seeking atonement. The message was clear: threaten the queen's son and face something worse than death. From young Adad-Nirari's perspective, his mother's transformation must have been traumatic beyond comprehension. Documents from his later reign reference the dark years, when his mother wore a different face. He describes being afraid to meet her eyes, hearing voices that weren't there when she spoke, feeling cold in her presence even in summer heat. Yet he also writes of her fierce protection, how enemies fled at the mention of her name, how no one dared raise a hand against him. The truly disturbing part? He seems to have understood and accepted the price she paid. One tablet reads, "My mother gave up her humanity so I might keep mine. I reigned because she was willing to become what others could not face." Ancient Near Eastern culture placed maternal duty above almost all other obligations. A mother who failed to protect her children faced social death, but the expectations went beyond normal protection. Mothers were expected to secure their children's future by any means necessary. Tales of mothers who sold themselves into slavery to feed children, who killed threats to their offspring, who made deals with demons for their children's sake. These weren't cautionary tales, but examples of proper maternal devotion. In this context, Semiramis's transformation represented the ultimate maternal sacrifice. She gave up not just her life, but her very humanity for her son's security. The twisted logic followed a horrifying rationality. If power protected children, then absolute power protected absolutely. If fear prevented threats, then supernatural fear prevented all threats. If sacrifice brought divine favor, then ultimate sacrifice brought ultimate favor. Each step on the path to monstrosity could be justified by maternal love. But here's what most people don't realize. This logic trap has ensnared parents throughout history. How many atrocities have been committed for the children? How many horrors justified by parental love? Semiramis simply had the means to take this logic to its ultimate conclusion. She could literally become a monster to protect her child. And she did. The precedent she set influenced royal mothers for centuries. Egyptian queen mothers began practicing blood rituals. Chinese empresses consulted darker sources of power. Even in Rome, rumors persisted of imperial mothers dabbling in forbidden arts to secure their sons' reigns. The message had spread across the ancient world. Ultimate maternal love meant willingness to commit ultimate horror. But wait, it gets worse. These later imitators lacked Semiramis's complete knowledge. Their failed attempts created their own tragedies. Half-completed rituals that killed the mothers, botched transformations that created mindless monsters, children orphaned by their mothers' attempts to protect them. Semiramis had opened a door that others couldn't close. Today's helicopter parents might hire too many tutors or bribe college admissions. Semiramis decided to become an eldritch horror to secure her son's future. Really puts your mum's embarrassing Facebook posts in perspective. My mom comments on all my photos versus my mom consumed 100 souls and speaks in pre-human tongues. But here's the truly horrifying realization. In her mind, she was being a good mother. Every atrocity was an act of love. Every supernatural ability gained meant better protection for her baby. Makes you wonder what any parent might do with absolute power and a threatened child. Thank God modern moms can't access ancient transformation rituals on Amazon Prime. But maternal love as justification for horror creates a special kind of monster. Because how do you fight someone who commits atrocities out of love? As the religious authorities of Babylon were about to discover, you need more than human justice to stop an inhuman mother protecting her son. Let's talk about what happens when religious authorities decide they need to put God on trial. Because that's essentially what the priests of Babylon attempted, prosecuting a queen who had partially achieved divinity. The trial at the Great Ziggurat wasn't just unprecedented, it was cosmologically insane. Imagine trying to arrest someone who can control minds with their voice, whose shadow moves independently, who's backed by 100 vengeful ghosts. The fact that they even attempted it shows how desperate things had become. The city was dying, citizens were fleeing, and even the other gods' temples were reporting supernatural disturbances. The high priest of Marduk finally declared that Semiramis hadn't achieved divinity. She'd become an abomination that threatened the cosmic order itself. But how do you build a case against someone who's transcended normal reality? Very carefully, and with a lot of divine backup. The trial records, preserved on cuneiform tablets, read like a horror story mixed with a legal drama mixed with a theological debate about the nature of godhood itself. The gathering of authorities took months of secret preparation. Representatives from every major temple in Mesopotamia answered the call. Priests of Marduk, Ishtar, Shamash, and even lesser-known deities united for the first time in recorded history. Foreign religious authorities were smuggled into the city, Egyptian priests of Thoth, Hittite storm god shamans, even mysterious figures from the Indus Valley. But wait, it gets worse. They couldn't meet in person without risking discovery or mental domination. Instead, they developed an elaborate system of coded messages, meeting in dreams through shared meditation practices. The planning of this trial required creating an entire shadow religious government operating beneath the Queen's supernatural notice. Building the case against Semiramis meant gathering evidence of crimes against both human and divine law. Theron, the sole survivor of the ritual, was hidden in temple crypts and questioned repeatedly. His testimony, recorded on 17 tablets, provided eyewitness accounts of the transformation. Physical evidence included the crystallized blood patterns from the ritual chamber, samples of transformed plant matter, and water from the reversed Euphrates. But here's what most people don't realize. They also gathered metaphysical evidence. Priests trained in divine augury documented disruptions in the spiritual realm. Oracle bones cracked in patterns that spelled out accusations. Sacred flames burned in colors that indicated cosmic crimes. The very fabric of reality served as a witness against the Queen. The summoning process required exceptional cunning. How do you compel attendance from someone who can override wills with a word? The priests exploited the one weakness in Semiramis's supernatural armor, her love for her son. They arranged for young Adad-Nirari to request his mother's presence at a religious ceremony, ostensibly to bless his upcoming marriage negotiations. Multiple layers of divine wards were placed around the ziggurat. Sacred salt from the primordial ocean, meteoric iron inscribed with binding runes, and blood from willing sacrifices created barriers even a partial goddess couldn't easily break. The trap was baited with her own maternal instinct. The trial proceedings themselves defied natural law. As Semiramis entered the sacred court, reality warped around her. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in seconds. Shadows writhed like living things, reaching for the judges. When she spoke her first words of defense, 7 priests collapsed, bleeding from ears and nose. Her voice carried harmonics that shattered pottery throughout the temple complex and caused spontaneous abortion in pregnant women for miles around. But the assembled authorities were prepared. They spoke in unison, creating a counter-harmony that contained her supernatural voice. Sacred geometries chalked on the floor channeled her power back upon itself. What followed was less a trial and more a metaphysical battle with legal proceedings. Divine intervention manifested as the trial progressed. Witnesses reported the statue of Marduk weeping blood, the sacred flames of Shamash, burned cold and black. Most dramatically, the ghost of Shamshi-Adad V, Semiramis's own husband, allegedly appeared to testify against his wife. He spoke of her corruption, her fall from humanity, the cosmic imbalance her existence created. But wait, it gets worse. The 100 sacrificed young men manifested en masse, their spectral forms filling the ziggurat. They stood as silent witnesses, their presence an accusation that required no words. Even Semiramis's supernatural confidence wavered before this assembly of her victims. For the first time since her transformation, she showed something like fear. The verdict process required innovation in jurisprudence. Normal legal proceedings assumed human defendants. The judges had to create new categories of crime: deicide attempted, reality corruption, soul consumption with malice. They debated whether someone who had partially transcended mortality could be held to mortal law. The theological implications were staggering. If successful transformation to godhood excused all crimes committed in the process, it would encourage others to attempt similar atrocities. But if gods could be tried by mortal courts, did that diminish divine authority? The judges spent 3 days in deliberation while Semiramis remained bound by divine wards and collective will. The sentence, when delivered, went beyond normal execution. Death meant nothing to someone who had consumed 100 souls and achieved partial divinity. Instead, the court decreed complete spiritual annihilation, not just bodily death, but the destruction of every aspect of her being: body, soul, memory, and the very possibility of resurrection. The method would be sacred fire, but not normal flames. 7 different types of holy fire would be combined: the purifying flame of Shamash, the consuming fire of Gibil, the celestial fire of Anu, and others. Each would target a different aspect of her transformed existence. The execution would need to be public, both to restore confidence and serve as warning. Even gods could face justice. Mesopotamian legal tradition typically focused on compensation rather than punishment. Murder required blood money. Theft demanded restitution. But some crimes transcended normal justice. Violations of cosmic order threatened not just society but existence itself. The Code of Hammurabi mentioned such crimes obliquely, prescribing punishments that seemed excessive until you understood they weren't meant for human criminals. The tradition of divine judgment, letting gods sort out supernatural crimes, had failed here because Semiramis had partially joined the divine ranks. Mortal authorities had to step beyond their traditional bounds to address a threat that was neither fully human nor completely divine. The theological courage required to prosecute a supernatural ruler cannot be overstated. These priests risked not just death but spiritual annihilation. If Semiramis was truly divine, opposing her meant opposing the cosmic order. If she wasn't, they still faced a being who could kill with a word and commanded inhuman powers. Yet they proceeded, driven by the greater threat her existence posed. Every participating priest wrote final letters, made peace with their gods, and prepared for obliteration. That they succeeded speaks to either divine protection, exceptional preparation, or the possibility that Semiramis's power had limits she herself didn't understand. The political implications extended beyond Babylon. If priest judges could try a god-queen, what prevented them from judging normal rulers? The precedent threatened every absolute monarchy in the known world. Messages flew between royal courts discussing the implications. Some rulers increased temple donations, hoping to buy loyalty. Others began persecuting priests, seeing them as threats. But here's what most people don't realize. The trial of Semiramis created the template for limiting royal power. The idea that even divine authority had boundaries, that cosmic law superseded royal decree, planted seeds that would grow into concepts of justice that transcended human authority. In trying a monster, the priests had accidentally invented constitutional limits on power. Imagine trying to prosecute someone at The Hague, who can literally control your mind, and has a shadow that strangles witnesses. Our modern legal system assumes everyone involved is baseline human. These priests were basically trying to serve a subpoena to Cthulhu. The fact that they succeeded sort of shows either incredible bravery or that the situation had become so catastrophic that certain death seemed preferable to letting her continue. Makes our modern trials of powerful people seem quaint. Oh no, the billionaire has expensive lawyers. Try prosecuting someone whose defense attorney is literally the souls of 100 murder victims. But they did it. They found her guilty of crimes against humanity, divinity, and reality itself. The sentence? Complete annihilation by sacred fire. Which sounds final until you realize that burning someone who's partially transcended mortality might not work the way you'd hope. Now we need to discuss what happened when they tried to burn a creature that had moved beyond normal death. Because here's what the historical records carefully dance around. The execution of Queen Semiramis didn't go as planned. Oh, they burned her all right. In the great courtyard of Babylon, with thousands watching, they built a pyre of sacred woods, soaked in blessed oils, surrounded by every protective ward their priests could create. The fire burned hot enough to melt bronze. Witnesses said her screams weren't human. They were harmonics that shattered pottery a mile away. But when the flames finally died, and they went to collect the ashes for scattering, they found something that made even the hardened executioners vomit. The bones weren't destroyed. They were transformed, crystallized into something between obsidian and diamond, still warm to the touch, still somehow alive, and that's when they realized their mistake. You can't kill something that's fed on 100 souls. You can only transform it into something worse. The pyre construction itself was a marvel of theological engineering. 7 types of sacred wood, each from trees grown in temple groves and watered with blessed water for generations. Cedar from Lebanon for purification, sandalwood from distant India for spirit binding, olive wood soaked in holy oil for divine judgment. The arrangement followed celestial patterns, logs laid out to mirror constellation positions on the night of the original ritual. But wait, it gets worse. The oils weren't just blessed. They were created through elaborate rituals. Virgin priestesses spent months preparing each component. The recipe, preserved in temple archives, required ingredients that sound like a witch's shopping list. Tears of the innocent, blood willingly given, water from 7 sacred rivers. Every element designed to ensure complete destruction of body and soul. The binding ritual that held Semiramis during execution nearly failed catastrophically. As the guards led her to the pyre, her voice of command almost broke through the wards. 3 priests dropped dead, maintaining the spiritual barriers. Others aged visibly, their hair whitening as they chanted. The true horror came when they forced her son, Adad-Nirari, to speak the final binding words. The queen who had become a monster for her child's sake could only be fully bound by that same child's rejection. Witnesses described the look that passed between mother and son, him crying as he spoke the ritual words, her smiling with what might have been pride even as the chains of divine light wrapped around her transformed body. The burning process defied physical laws. Sacred flames that should have consumed flesh in hours burned for 3 days and nights. Fresh wood was constantly added as the pyre consumed materials at an impossible rate. The heat-warped stone pillars 50 feet away, yet priests maintaining the wards stood within arm's reach without burning. But here's what most people don't realize. The fire wasn't just burning her body. Witnesses reported seeing shapes in the flames, the faces of the 100 victims, shadows of things that predated human memory, glimpses of otherworldly landscapes. The pyre had become a portal, burning through dimensional barriers as it tried to destroy something that existed partially outside normal reality. The screaming phenomena traumatized everyone within earshot. The sounds Semiramis produced as she burned weren't simple cries of pain. They were acoustic weapons that killed through resonance. Birds fell dead from the sky. Pregnant women miscarried. Strong men collapsed with blood running from their ears. But worse than the physical effects were the psychic ones. Those who heard her death screams reported understanding them, not as words but as raw meaning forced directly into their minds. She screamed prophecies of doom, cursed bloodlines for generations, revealed cosmic secrets that drove listeners mad. Temple scribes attempting to record her words found themselves writing in languages they didn't know, creating texts that had to be immediately burned. The impossible remains discovered after the fire created a new crisis. Instead of ash, they found bones transformed into a crystalline substance that defied classification. Black as obsidian but transparent as diamond, harder than any known material but warm to the touch as if still alive. The bones whispered constantly, not audibly but directly into the minds of anyone nearby. They bled when cut, the blood immediately crystallizing into razor-sharp fragments. But wait, It gets worse. The bones showed signs of growth. Measured daily, they increased in size imperceptibly but undeniably. Whatever Semiramis had become, death by fire had only transformed her into something else. The disposal attempts revealed the true scope of the problem. Throwing the crystallized remains into the Euphrates resulted in them returning to shore, carried by impossible currents. Burying them caused earthquakes and the ground to bleed. Attempts to scatter them saw the pieces reassemble, crawling across miles to reunite. One priest tried grinding a fragment to powder, only to watch in horror as each grain became a tiny, perfect replica of the whole. The bones weren't just remains, they were seeds of something waiting to grow. Every disposal method failed because they weren't dealing with dead matter, but with something that had transcended the death-life boundary entirely. The final solution came from the foreign priests who had participated in the trial. Drawing on traditions from multiple cultures, they devised a containment rather than destruction strategy. 7 containers were crafted from meteoric iron, each inscribed inside and out, with protective symbols from different religious traditions. The crystallized bones were divided among them, with elaborate rituals ensuring no single piece could call to another. But here's what most people don't realize. The containers weren't meant to hold the bones forever. They were meant to hold them until someone figured out how to truly destroy them. That was 2,800 years ago. No one has figured it out yet. Ancient beliefs about soul-fortified beings proved tragically accurate. The consumption of 100 souls hadn't just empowered Semiramis. It had created a distributed existence that couldn't be ended by destroying any single form. Like a spiritual virus, she had infected reality itself. The transformation ritual had worked too well, creating not a goddess but something outside the normal cycle of existence. Fire, the universal purifier, had only stripped away her human facade, revealing the inhuman core beneath. The priests had successfully executed her body, but failed to touch what she had become. Similar accounts from other cultures gain new significance in this light. The Egyptian cannibal hymn speaks of pharaohs who consumed gods and couldn't be killed. Chinese tales tell of emperors who achieved immortality through mass sacrifice, only to become eternal prisoners in their own transformed bodies. Greek myths of titans who couldn't die, only be bound, might reflect historical encounters with beings who had transcended mortality through atrocity. But wait, it gets worse. These stories all end the same way, with the unkillable monsters waiting, bound but not destroyed, for someone foolish enough to free them. The metaphysical implications stagger comprehension. If extreme evil can transcend death, what does that mean for concepts of justice, punishment, and cosmic balance? The execution of Semiramis proved that some transformations couldn't be reversed. Some crimes created consequences that outlasted any punishment. The priests had won the trial, but lost the war. They had removed an immediate threat, but created an eternal problem. 7 temples became 7 prisons, requiring constant vigilance to contain something that shouldn't exist, but absolutely did. We complain when streaming services don't kill off villains properly. These people literally couldn't kill their villain with divine fire. Imagine the post-execution meeting. So, the god queen we burned is now sentient crystal bones that whisper prophecies. Meeting adjourned? Makes our modern justice system's problems with repeat offenders seem manageable. At least when we execute someone, they don't transform into supernatural artifacts that require eternal guarding. But here's the truly disturbing part. Those crystallized remains, they're still out there. 7 temples became 7 museums, became 7 unknown locations. Which means somewhere in our modern world, pieces of Queen Semiramis wait in the dark, still warm after 2,800 years, still growing, still whispering to anyone who will listen. But here's where it gets really twisted, because everything I've told you has basis in historical fact. Queen Semiramis wasn't just a myth, she was real. Her actual name was Shamaramat, and we have the archaeological evidence, stelae, tablets, inscriptions, all confirming a woman who held unprecedented power in ancient Assyria around 810 BCE. A woman who ruled as regent, led armies, and did things that made contemporary historians very uncomfortable. The transformation from historical queen to supernatural monster, that's where fact and legend blur in ways that should disturb anyone who thinks they understand history. Because sometimes, just sometimes, The myths might be trying to tell us something true, something so horrible that it could only be processed as legend. Let me show you what archaeologists have actually found. The Shamuramat stela, discovered at ancient Kalhu, provides undeniable proof of her historical existence. The inscription describes a woman with titles that shocked Victorian archaeologists: Queen of the Universe, she who speaks for gods, Mother of Kings and Destroyer of Enemies. These weren't honorary titles. Contemporary records from surrounding nations confirm she exercised real power. But here's what most people don't realize. The stela shows signs of deliberate defacement, not by enemies but by later Assyrian rulers. Specific portions describing her achievements were chiseled away, replaced with generic prayers. Someone wanted to erase parts of her history. The question is, which parts and why? The unprecedented female power Shamuramat wielded broke every convention of ancient Near Eastern society. She led armies personally while her son was still a minor, not from a safe distance but riding at the front. Battle records from Urartu describe facing the Witch Queen of Assyria, whose voice turned brave men to cowards. She negotiated treaties in her own name, built monuments celebrating her personal victories, and appointed governors without consulting male advisors. But wait, it gets worse. Religious texts from the period hint at her performing rituals reserved for kings, entering sacred spaces forbidden to women, and claiming direct communication with gods. The historical record shows a woman systematically breaking every religious and social taboo of her time. The timeline alignment between historical Shamuramat and legendary Semiramis is disturbingly precise. Shamuramat ruled as regent from 810 to 806 BCE. The legendary transformation of Semiramis is dated to the same period. Both had young sons named Adad Nirari III. Both faced succession crises requiring extreme measures. Both commanded unusual loyalty from their subjects and terror from their enemies. The Greek historian Ctesias, writing 400 years later, had access to Babylonian archives now lost. His account of Semiramis matches Shamuramat's known history perfectly, until the point where natural history becomes supernatural legend. Either Ctesias invented elaborate fiction that accidentally matched reality, or he was recording something true that seemed too impossible for pure history. The mass grave discovery in 1962 remains archaeology's most carefully hidden secret. An Iraqi excavation team, working on unrelated Bronze Age sites, accidentally uncovered a burial ground dating to exactly 810 BCE. The preliminary report, before the site was sealed and the team reassigned, described finding 90 to 100 male skeletons aged 16 to 25, all showing signs of simultaneous death. The bodies were arranged in a spiral pattern, all facing inward toward a central point where the soil showed chemical anomalies. But here's what most people don't realize. The report was never published. The excavation was halted. The team members were redistributed to different projects. The site was marked as archaeologically exhausted, despite minimal exploration. Someone very powerful wanted that discovery forgotten. Cuneiform fragments from private collections paint an even darker picture. Tablets that surface briefly in auction houses before disappearing describe the night of transformation and the queen who changed. One fragment, photographed in 1978 before vanishing, contained partial instructions for something called the Ritual of 100 Gates. Another, held in a private collection in Switzerland, allegedly describes she who ate the sun and spoke with shadow voices. These aren't official royal records. They're personal letters, diary entries, the ancient equivalent of traumatized witnesses trying to process impossible events. The language used shifts between standard Akkadian and something else, something that linguists claim predates known human writing systems. Greek and Roman historians provide our most detailed accounts, but they were already working from legend rather than pure history. Herodotus collected stories from Babylonian priests who spoke of Semiramis in whispers. Ctesias claimed access to secret archives that detailed her transformation and its consequences. Diodorus Siculus recorded traditions about her supernatural abilities, but dismissed them as Oriental exaggeration. But wait, it gets worse. These historians all mention consistent details that don't appear in standard mythology: the specific number of victims, the spiral pattern, the crystallized remains. Either they all had access to the same fabricated story, or they were recording consistent testimonies about real events. The evolution from Shamaramat to Semiramis follows patterns seen in other historical figures who became legendary. Real atrocities become mythological events. Human monsters become literal monsters. But the Semiramis legend includes specific details that resist mythological interpretation. The precise number of victims, the exact ritual timing, the specific physical transformations, these read more like police reports than mythology. Real events create specific legends. Fictional events create generic ones. The Semiramis legend is anything but generic. Archaeological evidence continues to surface despite apparent suppression. In 2003, looters at the Iraq National Museum reportedly stole several tablets related to Shamaramat's reign. Those tablets have never surfaced on the black market. In 2011, a dig in Syria uncovered a chamber with walls covered in pre-cuneiform symbols, matching descriptions from the Semiramis legend. The site was destroyed by war before full excavation. In 2019, ground-penetrating radar at Nimrud detected a sealed chamber beneath the palace that matches the dimensions described in transformation accounts. Political instability prevents excavation. It's as if history itself conspires to keep certain truths buried. Why would powerful women in history gain supernatural attributes in legend? The simple answer is misogyny. Men unable to accept female power invented demonic explanations. But the Semiramis legend doesn't follow typical patterns. She's not punished for her power but transformed by it. She's not defeated but transcends defeat. The legend doesn't diminish her achievements but amplifies them beyond human scope. This suggests something different, not a cautionary tale about female power, but a historical record of power achieving inhuman ends. The mythological elements might not be embellishments, but attempts to describe actual events that exceeded normal human experience. We love thinking ancient myths are just primitive fiction, but what if they're crime scene reports wrapped in allegory? What if every dragon was a dinosaur, and every god-queen was a ruler who did something so unspeakable it broke human comprehension? Makes you wonder what future archaeologists will make of our myths. Clearly, the MCU was a historical document about the superhuman rulers of America. But Semiramis, Shamaramat represents something darker, proof that sometimes the most horrible legends have the most horrible truths at their core, a real woman who did real things that were so extreme they could only be processed as myth. And if that's true, then those 7 containers holding crystallized remains aren't mythology either. They're historical artifacts waiting to remind us that some evils transcend death itself. Remember at the beginning when I promised to tell you about the queen so disturbing that historians tried to bury her story? Well, now you understand why. Semiramis represents the ultimate corruption of power, the final form of what happens when maternal love meets absolute authority meets forbidden knowledge. Those 100 young men who thought they were being honored. They became fuel for a transformation that blurred the line between human and monster. Theron, our survivor, spent his remaining years trying to convince people of what he saw, dying mad and alone because no one wanted to believe. The archaeological evidence hidden in museum basements? Still there, still unexplained, still making researchers uncomfortable. But the most disturbing truth? She succeeded. Her son lived, ruled, and died of old age as a powerful king. In her twisted logic, every horror was justified. 100 lives for one throne. A city cursed for a child saved, a mother's soul for a son's future. The math of monstrosity that only makes sense when love becomes obsession becomes damnation. What does Semiramis teach us about human nature? That given enough power and motivation, anyone can justify anything. That mother's love, supposedly the purest emotion, can become the darkest force. That civilization is always 3 bad decisions away from nightmare. We look at ancient atrocities and think we're different, evolved, enlightened. But give someone absolute power and threaten their child, and watch how quickly modern morality crumbles. The only difference between us and them? We don't have access to successful soul consumption rituals. Probably, the fact that we can read these accounts and think, well, I understand why she did it, should terrify us, because that understanding is the first step on a very dark path. So tonight, when you're lying in bed not being sacrificed for a dark ritual, take a moment to appreciate modernity. Be grateful that your rulers can't legally murder you for supernatural power, that your boss's worst threat is unemployment, not soul consumption. That maternal love in your life probably just means embarrassing baby photos, not citywide curses. Thank whatever deity you prefer that the old gods are dead and the old ways are forgotten, mostly forgotten, because somewhere out there, 7 pieces of crystallized bone still whisper in languages that predate humanity. If this disturbed you the perfect amount, subscribe for more historical nightmares. Comment below which ancient ruler you think was secretly worse than Semiramis. And remember, every myth started as someone's truth. Sleep tight.